In Sorrow Estate, the morning sun glared off pristine rooftops, but beneath the picture-perfect facade, war was brewing. Overgrown rose bushes twisted like claws, a silent warning of the chaos to come. Saul, my grandson, limped forward, gripping his cane like a warrior's sword. Today wasn't just another HOA battle. It was a reckoning, and at the center of it all, Karen Feyn, the ruthless HOA queen who ruled with an iron fist and a smug sneer. She saw Saul as weak, broken, a 19-year-old orphan she could crush without consequence. She was dead wrong. Today, in a courtroom buzzing with skeptical reporters and whispering neighbors, Saul would do the unthinkable. He would pull the rug out from under Karen and expose the rot at the heart of Sorrow Estate's HOA. No one believed he could win, not the board, not the community, and certainly not Karen. But when this day was over, everything would change. And Karen? She'd finally learn what happens when you push the wrong man too far. Think you know where this is going? Think again. Because what happens next? No one is ready for it. Hey, before we jump into this wild story, I have a small favor to ask. If you could take a second to hit that like button and subscribe, it would really help our channel grow and bring you even more crazy stories like this one. Also, we love seeing where our audience is tuning in from. Drop a comment below and let us know which city you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far our community is spreading. The day it all began, a single letter arrived at Saul's mailbox. It looked harmless enough, a crisp white envelope with the Sorrow Estate HOA logo, but inside, a ticking time bomb. A threat to sue if he didn't comply with their so-called new property improvements policy. Saul's hands trembled as he unfolded the letter. His house, the only thing left of his parents, was now in the HOA's crosshairs. They wanted it, badly. It sat at a prime corner in the neighborhood, perfect for redevelopment, and with his parents gone, they thought he was easy prey. A grieving, disabled 19-year-old man with no fight left in him. They were so wrong. As he stared at the paper, his mind flashed back to the funeral. That suffocating day when the neighbors had shown up with their fake sympathy, offering empty smiles and hollow condolences. And at the center of them all, Karen, the HOA president, the queen of condescension. She had patted his shoulder and cooed, "We're all here for you, dear." What a joke. The moment the flowers wilted and the insurance payout didn't come fast enough, the fines began to rain down. Excessively chipped paint on the mailbox, $200. Unsightly wheelchair ramp blocking the walkway, $100. Yeah, because who cares about the Americans with Disabilities Act, right? Certainly not the great and powerful HOA. Overgrown lawn longer than 2 inches, $90. Saul mowed that lawn so often he practically developed a personal relationship with each blade of grass, but it didn't matter. The fines kept piling up. And soon they weren't just trying to bleed him dry, they were trying to force a foreclosure. At first he tried to fight back the polite way. He sent emails. He repainted the mailbox. A nice HOA-friendly pastel blue, thank you very much. He even trimmed his grass until it looked like the front 9 at Augusta National. But no, the fines didn't stop. And then the legal threats arrived. That's when Saul realized this wasn't about compliance. It was about control. Enter Zelger Pierce, the HOA's attack dog, a lawyer who looked like he crawled out of a vat of expired mayonnaise. His letters were smug, filled with legal jargon designed to make Saul feel small. He claimed that if Saul didn't voluntarily deed over a portion of his land for community enhancements, the HOA would drown him in lawsuits. Translation, give us your land or we'll make your life a living hell. Some neighbors murmured sympathy, but when it came time to actually help, crickets. That's when I, his grandfather Joel, stepped in. When I saw what they were doing to my grandson, something ancient and primal roared to life inside me. I had heard HOA horror stories before, families bullied into selling their homes, disabled folks harassed out of their neighborhoods, working-class people crushed under unfair fines. But seeing it happen to my own blood, that was a line in the sand. We sat at the kitchen table, the air thick with memories of family breakfasts, laughter that had long since faded. But as I looked at Saul, I saw something in his eyes that made my heart swell with pride. He wasn't scared anymore. "Gramps," he said, voice steady, "they want to test me in court. Let's see how they handle me fighting back." I worried. Of course I did. The HOA had money, power, and an entire legal team. They thought they were untouchable. Karen, that leather-faced dictator, openly mocked him. "Oh, sweetie," she simpered one afternoon, fake sympathy dripping from every word. "You really should just settle. Well, let's just say legal battles aren't for everyone." Saul stared at her. "Oh, you mean disabled people? Is that what you were about to say?" Her lips curled. "Oh, don't be dramatic." Zelger Pierce smirked. "This isn't a fight you can win, son. Why not save yourself the embarrassment?" Saul grinned. "Oh, I'm counting on embarrassment, just not mine." They laughed at him. They had no idea they were lighting a fuse under a legal genius. Saul had spent years reading up on law for fun. And now? Now he had the perfect chance to use it. They underestimated him because of his limp, because he was alone, because they thought money could buy them victory. They were about to learn the hardest lesson of their lives. This was war, and Saul, he was just getting started. The day of the hearing, Saul showed up in a simple gray suit, leaning on his cane. Karen Feyn arrived in a sleek black dress that practically screamed, "I'm in charge," with Zelger beside her in a fancy tie. They breezed in with condescending smiles, ignoring the few local reporters who'd come out of boredom. People said it was unlikely reporters would care about an HOA dispute. But in Sorrow Estate, folks gossip about everything, so a few curious local journos decided to show. We took seats in the courtroom, tension thick as peanut butter. A judge named Patricia Malone presided, a stern woman with a reputation for not tolerating nonsense. Karen's side seemed confident that there was no legal precedent that could save him, ignoring that sometimes new precedents get made every day. Possibly this was their biggest mistake, underestimating my grandson. Zelger stood, rattling off all the reasons they wanted a summary judgment. Saul's wheelchair ramp was an eyesore, not approved by the HOA. The fence along his property line was a hazard, even though the HOA had moved it illegally onto his land. Late HOA dues, which soared after they kept adding made-up penalties. He spoke like a teacher scolding a naughty student. Meanwhile, Karen Feyn smirked, tossed her hair, and locked eyes with Saul, probably expecting him to melt under the pressure. This is the same Karen who once insulted a neighbor for having ugly curtains. She had zero empathy for a disabled orphan in her precious Sorrow Estate. When Zelger finished, he sat with a flourish, smiling as though he'd just read off a winning lottery ticket. The courtroom was silent for a moment. The judge turned to Saul. "Mr. Dawson, do you have a response?" Saul stood, leaning on his cane for support. He cleared his throat and said, "Your Honor, I do." Then he calmly laid out documents referencing the Americans with Disabilities Act, proving that a wheelchair ramp is not only necessary for him, but also protected by federal law, something the HOA apparently forgot to mention. That's when the first hush fell over the courtroom. A few watchers in the seats whispered. The judge's eyes flickered with interest. Saul kept going. "Furthermore, I have proof of a newly discovered email from the HOA board, where they explicitly discuss pressuring me to voluntarily give up my property or face lawsuits that would bankrupt me." He read a snippet that said, "We know he can't keep up with legal fees, so we'll bury him." A shocked murmur spread across the room. Karen's face turned the color of spoiled milk. Zelger's smirk disappeared so fast you'd think it got teleported to another dimension. Now, if you think the judge banged her gavel right then and dismissed the case, well, not so fast. HOAs are sneaky. Zelger jumped up with an objection, claiming the email was taken out of context. He insisted it was a private discussion, not official policy. Karen tried to wave it off with a laugh, calling it meaningless chatter. But the expression on the judge's face said she wasn't buying it. Saul, calm as could be, then introduced two more pieces of evidence. A hidden camera video from a neighbor's doorbell. It showed an HOA official creeping around Saul's lawn at night, measuring the grass length, apparently rummaging for petty infractions to fine him on. A statement from a local lawyer who'd once worked with the HOA. He testified they often weaponized small rules to force homeowners into compliance. I almost expected dramatic music to play as people in the courtroom gasped. Suddenly, The watchers realized this was more than a simple kid versus HOA case. This was a deliberate attempt to seize a disabled orphan's property. Karen's smirk twisted into a scowl. She hissed something to Zelger about damage control, obviously panicking. Then came the first big twist nobody saw coming. An ex-HOA board member named Nancy stepped forward. She was in the gallery, trembling with guilt, holding a folder of receipts. She confessed she was part of a group that wanted to push families with disabled children out of Sorrow Estate to keep property values high. "They told us no one wants to live in a place that accommodates wheelchairs," Nancy admitted, tears in her eyes. "That's discrimination against the disabled, and I couldn't keep quiet anymore." A hush fell. Some folks glared at Karen. Others shook their heads in disbelief. The reporters who initially came to watch paint dry nearly fell out of their seats. Discrimination? That was no small claim. This was turning into a bigger scandal than a simple property line fight. And boy, was Karen furious. Judge Malone wasn't one for nonsense, and right now, she looked like she had just bitten into a lemon. Her sharp eyes flicked toward the HOA's table, her voice cold and slicing through the tension like a blade. "Is that true?" she demanded. "Are you discriminating based on disability?" A single bead of sweat trickled down Zelger's forehead. The once smug HOA enforcer who had spent years lording over residents suddenly looked like a deer caught in headlights. No, Your Honor," he stammered, his voice cracking. "We simply want to maintain the aesthetics." Karen, however, sat rigid, her lips pressed so tightly together they had practically disappeared. Her nostrils flared, her eyes burning with silent fury. If sheer contempt could melt a person, the entire courtroom would have been reduced to a pile of smoldering ash. Then Saul gave a small nod to Nancy, who looked like she was about to pass out but somehow found the strength to speak. Her voice trembled, raw with emotion. "Your Honor, that's not true. They made it clear they didn't want disabled residents ruining the image of Sorrow Estate." The courtroom sucked in a collective gasp. Zelger's face drained of color. Karen's eyes widened ever so slightly, just a flicker of fear before she masked it with another layer of icy disdain. This changed everything. The trial wasn't just about a wheelchair ramp anymore. This was a civil rights case now, a ticking time bomb about to explode in the middle of Karen's precious little kingdom. The HOA side sat frozen, their faces wrestling with sheer panic. Zelger, scrambling for a way out, threw his hands up like a cheap magician caught in the act. Well, Nancy's testimony is unreliable. She was fired for misconduct." Nancy gasped, her eyes welling up. "That's a lie. I resigned because I couldn't stand the shady behavior I saw behind closed doors. They pressured me to stay quiet." Her voice cracked, but her spirit didn't. And then, boom! The second twist hit like a freight train. The doors swung open and in strolled a bald man in a crisp navy suit, radiating the kind of quiet authority that makes even the cockiest villains break into a sweat. He strode confidently to the front and introduced himself in a steady, no-nonsense voice. "My name is Daniel Fremont. I represent the state legislature. We've been monitoring this case closely." He turned to Judge Malone and dropped the bombshell. "Right now, new laws are being discussed to protect residents from predatory HOAs and unscrupulous trailer park owners. If these allegations of discrimination hold," he turned to Karen, locking eyes with her like a hunter spotting prey, "it will strengthen the push for statewide reform." Karen's reaction was delicious. Her perfectly sculpted mask of superiority cracked, giving way to something primal: fear. She looked like someone had just informed her that her entire net worth had been donated to a local goat rescue. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out, her mind desperately clawing for a way to spin this in her favor. Her kingdom? Her untouchable power over Sorrow Estate? Poof! In one fell swoop, it was slipping through her manicured fingers like sand. "No, no, no!" Karen finally erupted, her voice laced with indignation. "This is outrageous! This entire courtroom is a circus. I have run this community flawlessly for years. We are a prestigious neighborhood, not some charity case for people who can't afford a proper home." The room fell into stunned silence. Did she really just say that? Judge Malone's eyebrow twitched. "Miss Feyn, I strongly advise you to stop talking." Karen didn't. Of course she didn't. "I will not stand here and be slandered by a bunch of peasants." She gestured wildly at Nancy and Saul. "These people don't understand what it takes to maintain standards. We can't just let any riffraff install whatever monstrosities they want. If you let them build ramps, next thing you know, they'll be painting their houses purple." Somewhere in the back, someone snorted. Even the bailiff coughed to cover up a laugh. For the first time in her life, Karen Feyn had lost control. And from the way the courtroom buzzed with barely contained amusement, she knew it. Back at the defense table, Saul remained calm, though I could see a flicker of relief in his eyes. He'd always believed the law should help people, not crush them. This new revelation offered him a safety net. If they proved the HOA intentionally discriminated, the entire case could become a massive scandal, and Karen might face serious consequences, even personal liability. Nevertheless, Zelger tried to fight back, throwing out every legal argument he could. He referenced obscure clauses in the Sorrow Estate Covenant. He tried to paint Saul as irresponsible, implying the ramp was not up to code. But the judge saw right through it. "Is that code from before or after the county's ADA compliance was updated?" she asked. Zelger stumbled over his words, rummaging through papers. From the corner of my eye, I spotted Karen's husband, Greg Feyn, a real piece of work known for insulting neighbors who can't keep perfect yards, slinking in. He whispered frantically into Karen's ear, something about, "Don't let them mention the email chain." She snapped back at him to shut up. The tension was so thick you'd need a chainsaw to cut it. Finally, the judge had heard enough. She told Zelger, "We'll hear final arguments, and then I'll decide whether to move forward with a summary judgment in favor of the defense or proceed to a full trial with possible discrimination charges." Karen paled. Saul nodded, gathering his notes calmly. That's when we took a brief recess. I patted Saul on the shoulder. "Proud of you, kid," I whispered. "No matter what happens, you've shown them you're not to be messed with." He gave me a small smile, still guarded. In the hallway, Nancy, the ex-board member, thanked him. "I'm sorry for not speaking up sooner. I was scared." He just shook his head. "Better late than never," he said. "I'm grateful." When we reconvened, the air crackled with anticipation. Judge Malone signaled the attorneys. First up, Zelger tried again, weaving a story about neighborhood standards and protecting property values. He used fancy jargon, possibly hoping to confuse Saul. He even slipped in a not-so-subtle jab that Saul's inexperience in legal matters is obvious. He actually smirked at the poor kid, except Saul wasn't rattled. When it was his turn, he stepped forward with surprising poise and said, "Your Honor, my father, may he rest in peace, was a paralegal. He taught me more about the law than you might expect. I have done my homework. Let's talk about actual code violations and legal frameworks, not imaginary eyesores." Then he proceeded to cite cases from other states, referencing how HOAs lost lawsuits when they discriminated or bullied disabled residents. He ended with, "If the ramp truly violated code, the HOA would have cited it long ago, long before my parents passed away. But they waited until it was just me, alone, grieving, thinking I couldn't fight back." A hush fell. The judge raised an eyebrow, impressed. Outside, you could have heard a pin drop. Remember the part about reporters wouldn't show for an HOA dispute unless celebrities are involved? Well, these local reporters got more than they bargained for. They were frantically scribbling notes, smelling a big story. "Young orphan fights corrupt HOA, shocking allegations of discrimination." Their cameras flashed, and boy, oh boy, Karen's cheeks turned crimson. She hissed to Zelger, "We have to settle or do something." Zelger gave a stiff nod. Possibly they thought they could throw hush money at Saul, but we saw that tactic coming from a mile away. At the end of that final argument, the judge looked each of them in the eye and made her ruling. "I find the evidence of discrimination credible enough to dismiss the HOA's complaint," she said. "Not only that, I'm ordering an investigation into possible civil rights violations." Karen practically shrieked, "Your Honor, you can't!" But the judge banged her gavel, unamused. "Watch me," she said. Zelger sank into his seat while Greg covered his face with his hands. The meltdown was real, and it was glorious. Applause broke out from a few spectators, some of them neighbors who disliked the HOA's bullying but never dared speak up. Nancy let out a sob of relief. Saul just stood there, leaning on his cane, letting out a breath he'd been holding. He didn't gloat, he just calmly nodded, as though he always believed in justice, despite the odds. Outside, the hallway was a circus, cameras and microphones everywhere. One reporter asked, "Saul, how does it feel to outmaneuver an HOA that tried to evict you?" He shrugged. "I just did what was right," he said softly. "People shouldn't be judged by appearances. That's a big mistake." Another reporter asked, "Are you moving out?" He shook his head. "No, this house is my family's legacy, and I'm staying." Later, as we left the courthouse, I overheard Karen threatening to get him next time, but her words sounded hollow. The attorney from the legislature, Mr. Fremont, approached us, handing Saul a business card. "If you ever want to help push for new laws, call me. We need more folks who understand what it's like to deal with predatory HOAs." Saul smiled, a real smile this time, and took the card. "I'll think about it," he said. "I believe we can make new precedents." In the car, I looked at him, my grandson who'd been through so much loss, yet stood tall in that courtroom. "Your parents would be proud," I told him, voice thick with emotion. He stared out the window, the corners of his mouth turning up. "I hope so," he murmured. "Maybe this is just the start, Gramps. I want to help people, folks who can't fight back alone." And I realized, for all Karen Feyn's arrogance and Zelger's fancy degree, for all the neighbors who stood by silently, believing an orphan on a cane couldn't stand a chance, Saul had proven them wrong. They saw only a disabled kid, but inside, he was a hurricane of determination. Just like one of our user comments said, "Never judge someone by appearances alone. True strength often lies beneath the surface." Word of the verdict spread through Sorrow Estate like wildfire. Some neighbors who had been too afraid to cross Karen stopped by to congratulate Saul, offering small gifts or just awkward apologies. Nancy led a small group demanding Karen resign from the HOA board. Lawsuits flew in both directions. Even folks from trailer home parks dealing with new owners reached out, sharing their nightmares about how laws fail to protect residents. It sparked a bigger conversation about changing the system so bullies like Karen can't prey on the vulnerable.